Hey guys, Soberoni of G&D Reviews here, and today I wanted to talk about the recent servant buffs in JP. For those of you who are not aware, recently Wu, Mysterious Heroine X Alter, Raikou, Arthur, and Osakabehime all received rather significant strengthening quests in JP that have given them really nice buffs to their skills or Noble Phantasm. And I've been playtesting with these buffs for a little bit under a week, so I have a general idea of how well these buffs integrate with these servants' kits and how effective they are. And I just wanted to give my 2 cents on what I think it means for those servants, how much it elevates their gameplay, and if they're worth investing in. So even if you're just playing on NA and you don't play JP at all, I do think you should watch this video so you can get some insight on the direction that these servants are heading in. So with that said, let's get started by first taking a look at Wu's buffs. So let's take a look at Wu first. Her upgrade is pretty straightforward. She received an NP interlude that increases the damage modifier on her Noble Phantasm to between 1600% and 2400% depending on level. And in addition, her Noble Phantasm now has the added effect of removing enemy buffs. Keep in mind that her Noble Phantasm is single target, so it's not an AoE buff removal, but still pretty damn impressive. Wu is very much an offensive support servant who thrives around her utility while also being able to deal some damage, very similar to Helena or Nero Caster. And this kind of buff helps her in both of those major areas. Of course, getting a buff to her NP damage means she's going to be able to dish out a lot more damage. Of course, she's no Carmilla or Jack, but she can hold her own, especially compared to other more support-based servants. But her bread and butter is definitely in her utility as a support. She is one of the major quick supports outside of Scotty, and now having the ability to remove enemy buffs is tremendously helpful. This makes her much more useful in difficult content because it gives her an extra layer of utility, where you can just swap her in with a kaleidoscope and have her remove all the enemy buffs. This is especially helpful if you're up against a rider enemy because you're not going to want to bring a caster, and it's hard to find buff removal outside of the caster class. It also makes her a very good switch-in option for the double Scotty meta, not only for giving your servant further buffs, but also for removing enemy defense buffs or anything that they might have like evade, and just generally softening up an enemy target. So this Noble Phantasm interlude basically helps her in everything she needs to do. I already thought Wu was one of the better offensive support servants in the game, and this buff just elevates her a little bit further up. This is a strong buff, and it's definitely going to be reflected in my servant spotlight of her in about a week or two's time. The next servant to receive a strengthening quest is Mysterious Heroine X Alter. She received an upgrade to her healing skill, Black Bean Paste, which has now been upgraded to Chestnut Paste rank EX. On top of the heal, it now gives her a 30% crit buff to her quick arts and buster cards for 1 attack or 3 turns. Now this may seem a bit confusing at first based on how it's worded because we don't really have a skill that works in this kind of way, but basically you're going to be getting 3 different buffs. A crit buff for quick cards, a crit buff for arts cards, and a crit buff for buster cards. Each of these buffs lasts until they're used once or until 3 turns passes, whichever happens first. And with this upgrade, MHX Alter now has some kind of crit related element on all 3 of her skills. So there is a bit of synergy between this and her other 2 skills, and when you are able to crit with this skill, it feels pretty good. You're going to be doing a lot more damage, and you're going to be getting a big chunk of NP gain back, which is going to further enable you to Noble Phantasm, which is something MHX Alter really wants to do. However, the big glaring issue with this upgrade is the fact that the crit buffs do not stack, and they only last for 1 hit or 3 turns. Keep in mind that Mysterious Heroine X Alter is still a berserker with no way of increasing her star weight directly, which means feeding her crit stars is a very difficult and unreliable task. It's just simply too hard to get full use out of this skill because you're going to need a crit with each type of card on a berserker who has no way of gathering stars. So while it does work good when it works, it's hard to get it to work reliably, unless you have her in a dedicated crit team and you're able to generate that 30 to 50 stars per turn. Or you have her on a team with someone like Brynhilda who can increase her star weight significantly. So overall, I don't think this buff really changes her position in the meta. It doesn't significantly elevate her gameplay. If anything, it's just a fun extra effect on her heal. But at the end of the day, she's still one of the top berserkers in the game. I don't really even think she needs any more buffs. So a fun skill for sure, but nothing really significant. Speaking of top tier berserkers, let's talk about Raikou, because if anyone needed an upgrade, it was Raikou. Raikou received an upgrade to her Eternal Arms Mastery skill, which has been upgraded to the Genji Clan Martial Arts Discipline rank EX. On top of the Star Absorption, she now gets a 60% crit buff for 3 attacks or 3 turns. This is a gigantic buff for Raikou, and it gives her possibly the largest 2-turn burst damage in the game. Essentially, after every Noble Phantasm, you're going to be able to follow up the next turn with unbelievable crit damage. This makes Raikou an even better sweeper who can just come in and deal ridiculous amounts of damage to any enemy, no matter who you're facing or what the circumstances are. But this is kind of what Raikou always was able to do. She's always been about Noble Phantasming and then following up the next turn with a lot of crit damage. So this doesn't change her playstyle at all, it just makes her even better at something that she was already great at. And this skill does last 3 turns or 3 hits on a rather short cooldown, so this is going to help you a lot with being able to keep up your damage in between Noble Phantasms, which was an issue with Raikou. And as is the trend with a lot of these upgrades to these servants, it makes her an excellent servant to pair with Osakabehime, which we'll get to at the end of this video. But suffice it to say, this does make Raikou a whole lot stronger. I already had her in my top 3 berserkers, and this really just further cements her spot in the top 3. She doesn't have as much survival as Herc or Alter, but what she doesn't have in survival, she more than makes up for in pure damage, and I would consider her the best pure damage berserker you can possibly get. So yeah, this buff was great, makes a great servant even greater. Taking a break from the berserkers, we have Arthur, who also received a fantastic upgrade. His instinct was finally removed and replaced with Dazzling Journey rank EX, which upgrades the amount of crit stars that he grants to 30 from 15, and it also increases his critical damage for 3 turns by 50%, and the cooldown is only 5 turns. If Raikou's buff was gigantic, this buff is game-changing, and this is really what Arthur needed to make himself stand out from the other sabers. It helps that he also has a bit of self-sufficiency thanks to the 30 crit stars that he generates with the skill. As a saber, he already has pretty good star gather weight, so it is very likely that you are going to crit whenever you use this skill, unless you're going to pair him with archers or riders, but in most cases he does provide the stars he needs to be able to crit with. But still, he does lack a star gather skill, so I don't recommend pairing him with archers or riders. But aside from that, this is a monumental upgrade to his kit, because it allows him to do a lot of damage even in between Noble Phantasms. He's not just a Noble Phantasm machine anymore. He can actually play a very active role in your crit team as the main damage dealer. In fact, in the footage I have, I think he does something like 100,000 or 130,000 damage with 1 crit at some point. So finally, Arthur has a niche as a crit saber, and provided you can give him crit stars, he can become an even better damage dealer than most sabers. I consider this to be the most game-changing upgrade out of this batch, because Arthur essentially went from being a very low tier servant to a very viable and strong crit servant. And as we're about to see with our next servant up on the list, it may be that crit teams are about to make a resurgence. That's right, finally we have Osakabehime, who received an upgrade to her Shapeshift skill, which now has the added benefit of increasing the party's critical damage for 3 turns by 50%. And that's going to be on a short 5-turn cooldown. She now has healing, damage buffs, and now a crit buff, which kind of makes her like a 5-star Hans almost. And as you may have noticed, Raikou, MHX Alter, and Arthur have all received gigantic crit buffs that make them perfect for pairing with Osakabehime. What a coincidence. I think thanks to this crit buff, she finally has a place that she can call her own as the main crit support. She doesn't have to live in the shadow of being the inferior Merlin or the inferior Scotty. In fact, this actually makes her an excellent complement to Merlin and Scotty if you're trying to specialize in a crit team, or handle some longer fights where you want healing or damage per turn to be a much bigger factor. I think Osakabehime is going to make a lot of crit team comps absolutely viable even for tougher content, because she gives crit teams everything they need. A great crit buff on a short cooldown, some pretty good star generating, as well as damage buffs and a good heal. I still don't quite think she's at the level with Merlin, Scotty, Waver, or Tamamo, but when it comes to supports, I would consider her just one step below them. And I think going forward, it's going to be fun playtesting with her and seeing what kind of crazy crit teams you can make. If nothing else, she's going to shake up the meta just a little bit. And those are my thoughts on the recent upgrades for the JP servants. Remember, if you're playing NA, those buffs are about 2 years away, so that's plenty of time to invest materials into those skills if you're interested. And if this video helped you or you enjoyed it, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you can catch all my FGO videos as they go up. And if you haven't already, do follow us on Twitch and Twitter, and join the party over on our Discord. Links are in the description below, and make sure you share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, this is Soberoni, signing out. Later.